I always say tariffs is the most beautiful word to me in the dictionary. Because tariffs are going to make us rich as hell. It's going to bring our country's businesses back.
Like many other small and medium-sized manufacturers I've talked to this year, Alpha USA is having problems with Trump's tariffs.
We're faced with an existential threat with this. Unless we get some relief or unless we can pass these costs on, our company and many companies like us probably won't exist by the end of next year.
Donald Trump promised that record-high tariffs would bring American manufacturing roaring back. He said it would mean more factories, more jobs, and fewer foreign dependencies. But here's what actually happened in 2025. The U.S. auto industry is being strangled by the very tariffs meant to save it, and the cracks are showing faster than anyone in Washington wants to admit. While Trump celebrates economic nationalism, it's Canada, steady, predictable Canada, that suddenly looks like the last anchor of stability in a North American supply chain now shaking from within. A new report from Detroit lays out the situation bluntly. At a small but essential manufacturing plant in Livonia, Michigan, Alpha USA is paying over $1 million in tariffs this year alone, with another $250,000 added every month. The company's entire business model is being rewritten by Trump's Section 232 and IEEPA tariffs, duties applied not to punish China or Mexico, but to imports the U.S. itself still relies on. Inside the factory, workers hold up simple metal fasteners, the kind that keep brake lines and wiring harnesses attached to a vehicle frame. Half the components they need still come from overseas. Domestic production cannot fill the gap, and the tariffs are hitting faster than any reshoring strategy can replace those imports. Meanwhile, the nationwide picture is no better. Despite months of promises about bringing jobs back, the U.S. has lost tens of thousands of manufacturing jobs this year. The auto sector alone is down more than 15,000. Trump's allies point to Stellantis restoring a shift at its Warren truck plant, calling it proof that tariffs move the needle. Yet the same plant endured mass layoffs only a year earlier, and even now the company's plans look more like political messaging than long-term industrial strategy. A temporary job shift is not a recovery. It is a reaction, and a fragile one. This moment captures a deeper truth. North America's auto supply chain is not three separate national systems. It is one integrated organism. When one artery is cut, the entire body weakens. Trump built his tariff argument on a simple idea. Make imported parts expensive enough, and companies will start producing everything at home. But the auto sector has spent decades growing across borders. A single component often crosses Canada-US or US-Mexico borders multiple times before final assembly. You cannot turn that system into an autarky overnight. You cannot nationalize a continental supply chain by shouting, "Build it here." And when tariffs were imposed, the first casualties were not foreign suppliers, they were American ones. At Alpha USA, a part that used to cost a dime now costs 15 cents. That difference may sound small, but multiply it across thousands of components, dozens of platforms, and millions of vehicles, and suddenly the entire cost base of American manufacturing rises. This is why U.S. car prices continue to move upward. It is not because of Canada. It is not because of Mexico. It is because Washington has chosen to tax its own supply chain into sclerosis. The irony cuts even deeper. The United States does not yet have the domestic capacity to replace the parts it is taxing. Even the Michigan fastener plant featured in the report still depends on imported nuts from Taiwan because there is no immediate domestic substitute. Trump's promise that America could build everything here in a single presidential term was never realistic, and the factories now caught between higher tariffs and limited domestic alternatives are paying the price. Canada, in contrast, remains a stable, integrated partner, technologically aligned, geographically close, and operating under world-class standards. No executive in the sector seriously views Canada as a security threat, despite Trump's rhetoric. In fact, Ottawa is the one partner that doesn't play games with supply chain rules. The U.S. may be the biggest economy in North America, but Canada is the one providing predictability. The Stellantis case is a perfect illustration of how politics, not economics, is now shaping U.S. auto employment. After Trump's new tariff announcement, Stellantis abruptly restored a shift at its Warren plant. Local union leaders celebrated, the White House claimed victory, and the press momentarily treated the move as evidence of a manufacturing renaissance. But look closely. This very same facility laid off more than 1,600 workers not long ago. There was no major new investment tied to the shift's return, and the supply chain feeding that plant remains stressed, fragile, and more expensive than before. The job exists because the tariff pressure exists. Remove the pressure or let the costs climb any higher, and the job disappears again. This is what analysts now call a political job, a job created to satisfy a talking point, not a growth strategy. Political jobs cannot sustain a regional economy, they don't attract new capital, and they don't survive downturns. Meanwhile, on the Canadian side of the border, Prime Minister Mark Carney continues to emphasize long-term planning, regulatory stability, predictable investment incentives, and rule-based frameworks. Carney's message is simple and consistent. We remain a stable, open, and reliable trading partner. That is exactly what global automakers want: stability, not tariff roulette.
Since returning to office, Trump has raised tariffs not only on China, but on Canada, Mexico, the EU, and even allies such as South Korea. The pattern is clear. Washington is isolating itself at the precise moment global supply chains are reorganizing. German auto exports to the U.S. have dropped sharply. Ford is canceling EV investments and absorbing multi-billion-dollar charges, and American consumers are paying more for vehicles while getting fewer choices. Canada, meanwhile, has played the long game. Ottawa has deployed targeted tax credits, opened new trade corridors in Asia, and strengthened industrial partnerships with South Korea, Japan, and the EU. Where the U.S. oscillates between confrontation and improvisation, Canada keeps presenting itself as the calm, grown-up counterpart, the partner companies can rely on during a turbulent decade. This matters because the future of the auto industry is globally competitive. China's dominance in EVs and batteries is still expanding. North America cannot afford to waste energy fighting itself. And yet, Trump's tariff policy does exactly that. It turns allies into suspects, partners into rivals, and shared opportunity into internal fragmentation. Trump promised that tariffs would restore American industrial greatness. Instead, they have revealed how deeply the U.S. depends on the continental supply chain it is now disrupting. Small suppliers are suffocating, automakers are hesitating, workers are caught in a policy whiplash that produces headlines one month and layoffs the next. Canada, on the other hand, is positioning itself as the steady hand, the reliable anchor in a region struggling to find its economic footing. And as the 2026 CUSMA review approaches, the fundamental question is becoming unavoidable. Will North America rebuild its shared advantage, or will Washington continue breaking the system in pursuit of political theater? Because one truth is already clear: Canada cannot stabilize the auto ecosystem alone, but the United States cannot stabilize it without Canada.
For many investors, gold bars like these have become a refuge from political turmoil and shifting economic winds, especially in Washington.
Reciprocal tariffs on countries throughout the world.
In times of uncertainty, investors reach for gold. But this time, it's not just about buying more of it. The wealthy are rethinking where they stash their treasure. Away from traditional vaults in London and Geneva, and east to new hubs like Singapore.
Gold has surged past $4,000 an ounce, shattering every record ever set in global markets. But the story isn't simply about precious metals becoming more precious. It's about something deeper, more structural, and far more political. Around the world, the wealthiest individuals are moving their gold out of Western vaults and into Singapore. And this shift says more about Washington under Donald Trump than it does about the price of gold itself. Investors aren't running towards Singapore because it is fashionable. They are running because the United States no longer feels like the world's anchor of stability. When the people who control trillions quietly move their assets away from America, it is not a market trend. It is a warning. And while the U.S. seems increasingly unpredictable, Canada is being seen, perhaps for the first time in decades, as a nation that still knows how to behave like a safe, steady, rules-based democracy. In an age when unpredictability drives capital away, Canada's calmness is becoming an economic advantage.
The global elite are rebalancing where they store their wealth. Instead of London, Geneva, or New York, the new preferred destination for long-term precious metal storage is Singapore. Vault operators there report an influx of clients from the US, Europe, and Australia who want their gold held far from political storms, tariff wars, and currency uncertainty. Behind the scenes, this behavior reflects the same calculation repeated in financial circles from Zurich to Hong Kong. When American politics becomes volatile, investors stop assuming the US dollar will remain a flawless safe haven forever. The second Trump administration has introduced new risks into the global system, whether through sweeping tariffs, unpredictable trade interventions, or the constant threat of escalations that could disrupt global supply chains. These are not abstract scenarios. They shape how investors judge long-term safety. Singapore benefits partly because it offers what America no longer guarantees: consistency. No sudden policy swings. No economic nationalism. No tariff surprises announced at midnight. No fear that a government decision could wipe out a decade of planning. In simple terms, Singapore has become the new symbol of predictable governance, and that is exactly what people with generational wealth value most. The U.S. has long sold itself as the safest place on earth to hold money. For most of modern history, that was largely true. But Trump's second term has put serious cracks in that foundation. His trade war has escalated rather than stabilized. His tariffs have grown broader, not narrower. And his political style has turned economic policy into a form of performance, where sudden announcements and unexpected threats can shake markets overnight. This atmosphere affects investor psychology. When the world's wealthiest look at the United States, they now see the possibility of abrupt tariff hikes, currency retaliation, strained relations with allies, and a domestic political landscape so polarized that long-term policy planning becomes almost impossible. Markets can handle risks, but they cannot handle chaos. And right now, the U.S. feels much closer to chaos than calm. That is why the symbolic shift of gold from west to east matters. In finance, gold is the oldest form of insurance ever invented. It is what people hold when they stop trusting governments, currencies, or institutions. When gold leaves the United States, it reflects a belief that American political unpredictability has crossed a threshold. For the super rich, this is not ideological judgment. It is defensive strategy.
This is where Canada enters the story, not because Canada is receiving the world's gold, but because Canada represents something increasingly rare in the Western world, a country that is stable, predictable, and governed with a long-term view. Under the leadership of Prime Minister Mark Carney, Canada is projecting the exact opposite image of Trump's America. Carney's background as a central banker shows in his approach. Policies are announced with caution, explained with clarity, and executed without drama. International investors notice this. Even in a year of global volatility, Canada has maintained a reputation for institutional strength. Its court system is predictable. Its banking sector remains one of the world's most resilient. Its trade strategy emphasizes diversification rather than confrontation, and its fiscal decisions avoid the extreme swings seen elsewhere. This does not mean Canada is immune from economic pressures. Like every nation, it faces inflationary challenges, high housing costs, and shifting demand in global markets. But while the U.S. responds to pressure with political brinksmanship, Canada responds with measured policy. That distinction matters enormously when global capital decides where to settle for the next generation. The contrast between the two neighboring countries grows clearer each month. One side of the border is governed by tariff theatrics and unpredictable executive orders. The other side is governed by steady financial management, trade diplomacy, and long-term planning. One country is fueling market fears. The other is quietly positioning itself as a stable economic counterweight. This contrast helps explain why analysts increasingly note that Canada could see indirect benefits from global capital flight. Not an explosion of gold shipments or dramatic inflows, but a gradual reevaluation among investors who ask themselves one simple question. If the United States continues on its volatile trajectory, where else in North America can I place long-term capital without constantly fearing political turbulence? The answer, for the first time in a long time, is Canada. Companies like Nokia, Toyota, Volkswagen, and major energy developers have already shown a willingness to expand in Canada whenever the U.S. becomes unpredictable. Investment houses in Europe note that Canada's sovereign bonds remain attractive precisely because institutions behave consistently. And in the Asian financial press, Canada is increasingly described as a medium-power safe haven, a country large enough to matter but stable enough to trust. Again, none of this implies a dramatic migration of the world's wealth into Canada, but it does mean that Canada's reputation is rising in relative terms. In a world reoriented by fear, steady countries gain value simply by staying calm. The global shift of gold storage towards Singapore marks the beginning of a wider story. It reflects a world where investors no longer assume the U.S. is automatically the safest place for their assets. It reflects a world where geopolitics shape financial decisions more than ever. And most importantly, it reflects a world in which stability becomes a premium commodity. Canada, by staying calm in a turbulent age, stands to gain credibility and influence. It does not need to compete with the U.S. directly or replicate Singapore's role in global finance. It simply needs to maintain the one quality the world's wealthiest people value most right now: predictable, sensible, long-term policy. If America continues down a path of volatility, the world's elite will keep diversifying their wealth away from Washington. And whether intentionally or not, Canada will become one of the few Western countries that investors see as a genuine alternative, a place where political storms are quieter, institutions are steadier, and the future feels less like a gamble.
CEO Andy England was hit with an existential crisis.
Well, it was not good, that's for sure.
He runs the Minnesota-based Phillips Distilling Company, the maker of sourpuss.
Vast majority, about 98%, is sold in Canada. And so, in many ways, we think of it as being a Canadian brand. And so all the more reason we should produce it in Canada. We've moved to Canada and are proud of it.
It's a small but symbolically important victory.
Canada just scored one of the most unexpected symbolic victories of the entire Canada-US trade war. And it came from a bright red bottle sitting in a nightclub bar. Sourpuss, the hard-to-forget sweet and sour drink that generations of Canadians have taken shots with, has officially abandoned the United States and moved its production across the border to Montreal. In a year dominated by Trump's tariffs, trade threats, and nationalist pressure campaigns, it turns out a simple party drink has delivered one of the clearest messages yet. When Washington pushes, Canada pushes back. And sometimes, the U.S. even loses business to us.
The story starts with a brand that most Canadians know by taste alone. Sourpuss was everywhere in the late 1990s and early 2000s. The kind of drink that lived behind the bar of every student pub and dive lounge. But what many Canadians didn't realize is that almost all of it was made in Minnesota by Phillips Distilling Company, a quiet American manufacturer that had grown deeply dependent on its northern market. CEO Andy England told CBC they sold around $23 million worth of sourpuss in Canada last year, and that an astonishing 98% of all sales worldwide come from Canadian customers. In the United States, the product barely exists. Then Trump's second-term trade war kicked into gear. As he slapped broad tariffs on Canadian goods, tariffs on steel, tariffs on aluminum, tariffs on autos, several Canadian provinces quietly retaliated. They didn't need to pass new laws or create big headlines. They simply stopped buying American-made liquor. Shelves that once stocked U.S. spirits went empty, Orders slowed to a crawl. Entire categories disappeared almost overnight. For Phillips Distilling, it was an existential threat. If Canada wasn't buying, the company wasn't selling. Their entire business model was about to collapse under the weight of a political fight they had nothing to do with. So after months of emergency planning, they made a decision that says more about the current North American trade climate than any speech or press release could. They shifted sourpuss production from Minnesota into a factory in Montreal under a new 5-year contract. England didn't sugarcoat the message. He admitted openly that provinces, quote, clearly want to buy liquor made in Canada, and that the company understood and accepted the reality. What started as a provincial protest suddenly became a cross-border production shift. A tiny victory on paper, but one that trade experts described as, quote, symbolically important for Quebec and for Canada as a whole.
The remarkable thing about this story is not the brand, the products, or even the size of the deal. It's the way everyday Canadian consumers, along with provincial liquor boards, managed to flip the logic of Trump's trade war upside down. This wasn't a fight launched by Ottawa. It wasn't a retaliatory tariff crafted by lawyers. It was simply a collective decision that if the United States was willing to weaponize trade, then Canadians could weaponize purchasing power. And it worked. The broader political backdrop makes this moment even more meaningful. Trump, now deep into his second term, has spent the year escalating tariffs across the world. China, Mexico, Canada, Europe, nobody has been spared. He has tried to force companies and countries to reorient supply chains toward American factories. But the unintended consequence has become increasingly visible. Many American producers are discovering that being made in the USA no longer guarantees access to the Canadian market. As the tariffs stack up, Canadian buyers, from the largest retailers to everyday shoppers, are choosing domestic alternatives. And when that happens at scale, companies like Phillips Distilling face a simple calculation. They can stay in the United States and lose the Canadian consumer entirely, or move part of their operations north and keep their survival intact. This is not an isolated case. Reuters, Bloomberg, and AP have all reported this year that Canadian cross-border shopping is dropping sharply. Flights, weekend trips, gas purchases, grocery runs, all have softened dramatically. Canadians are making a quiet but powerful statement. In an era where the U.S. president treats trade like a blunt weapon, Canadians are treating their dollar like a shield. It is economic self-respect, and it is starting to change corporate behavior. The timing adds another layer. Canada is entering a new phase of economic independence under Prime Minister Mark Carney, who has spent the year pushing for a more diversified trade portfolio. His government is investing heavily in clean energy, critical minerals, and coast-to-coast infrastructure. It is building new links with South Korea, ASEAN, and India. It is recalibrating ties with China after the surprising APEC turning point meeting between Xi Jinping and Carney. And it is preparing for a combative USMCA review in 2026, where Canada is expected to take a firmer stance than ever before. Against that backdrop, an American company moving production to Montreal, even a small one, sends a signal that echoes far beyond the beverage aisle. It suggests that Trump's tariffs, far from strengthening U.S. leverage, are accelerating a North American realignment that benefits Canada in subtle but real ways. If even an inexpensive, low-margin liquor brand can't afford to stay American-made, what happens when the same pressure hits sectors like auto parts, food processing, or household goods? The truth is that Canada's influence in the trade war has never been military, and it has never been about threats. It has been about market gravity. Canada is a massive, stable, high-income economy with an 85% clean power grid, critical mineral resources, and a consumer base that still has trust in domestic institutions. Companies need access to that market, and if earning that access means moving to Canada, many of them will. Sourpuss is simply the early signal. For the United States, especially the Trump White House, the optics here are uncomfortable. A policy designed to force production into America has instead pushed production out. A tariff meant to defend American industry has ended up eroding part of it. And a trade war intended to discipline Canada has instead revealed just how much leverage Canada actually has, not because of Ottawa's politics, but because of the choices of Canadians themselves.
In the grand scheme of global trade, one liquor brand moving factories won't alter the entire power balance. But symbolically, this moment matters. It shows that Canada isn't the quiet neighbor anymore. It shows that when pushed, Canadians can reshape markets simply by changing what they buy and what they refuse to buy. And it shows that Trump's trade war, far from putting Canada on the defensive, is increasingly pushing companies and supply chains toward Canadian soil. The question now is what happens next. If Sourpuss is the first brand to flee the U.S. for Canada, who will be the second? And what does it say about Trump's trade war when even American companies decide the safer future is north of the border? That's a story we'll be watching closely.
It's the same thing with the auto sector. He promised that he would negotiate a win. He promised to get a rapid deal. Still no win, still no deal. Elbows gone missing, and so are the...
We have the best deal with the Americans of any country. We have the lowest tariff on our automobiles and trucks of any country, but we are not satisfied. That is why we are negotiating a new accord on steel, on aluminum, on energy, and on auto.
Honorable Leader of the Opposition.
The room was tense, the echoes of Parliament filled with the sound of frustration and defiance. Across the aisle, the opposition leader launched a furious attack, accusing the Prime Minister of failing Canada's auto workers. He claimed that thousands of jobs were gone, that the promised deal with Washington never came, and that the government had simply given up. The Prime Minister stood, calm and steady, refusing to take the bait. His words were measured, confident. He said Canada already had the lowest auto tariffs in North America, and that new agreements on steel, aluminum, energy, and vehicles were underway. The noise in the chamber grew, but he didn't waver. That exchange was more than political theater. It was a snapshot of a country wrestling with identity, a test of whether Canada could hold its industrial ground as the United States turned inward. What began as an argument over auto jobs quickly became something larger, a question of national direction and dignity. In recent months, Canada's auto heartland has endured blow after blow. Two major events reshaped the conversation. First came Stellantis, moving Jeep Compass production from Brampton, Ontario to Illinois, investing about $13 billion in new facilities across the border. That single decision created roughly 5,000 American jobs, but erased 3,000 Canadian ones. Then came General Motors. The company halted production of its BrightDrop electric vans at the Carney plant in Ingersoll, Ontario, leaving another 1,200 workers without employment. Together, those two announcements wiped out more than 4,000 auto jobs within 2 weeks. The opposition seized the moment, calling it proof that the government's strategy had failed. In Parliament, the accusation was simple. Promises were made, jobs were lost, and confidence was fading. But the Prime Minister's answer carried a different tone. He spoke not only about recovery, but about restructuring, about how Canada would rebuild an industry no longer tied to decisions made in Washington. Behind the political noise was a new reality. The North American auto sector was shifting, and Canada was determined to write its own next chapter.
In the days following the debate, the outlines of Ottawa's industrial plan became clearer. Rather than retaliate against U.S. tariffs or chase short-term deals, the government began to reshape the entire manufacturing ecosystem. Officials from the Industry and Natural Resources Ministries confirmed that Canada was pursuing what they called a sectoral rebuild. The plan had three main pillars. First, diversify production chains. Canada is working with Mexico, the European Union, Japan, and South Korea to ensure that auto parts, batteries, and raw materials are not dependent on one source. Second, build domestic value chains. New federal and provincial programs are supporting investments in Ontario and Quebec to strengthen local parts production, EV battery assembly, and critical mineral refining. Third, negotiate focused agreements on individual sectors, especially steel, aluminum, and energy, to guarantee stable pricing and long-term access to key inputs. Industry analysts at Statistics Canada noted that even small policy shifts can determine where automakers locate new investment. A clear industrial direction can anchor thousands of high-skilled jobs for decades. The Prime Minister's approach is not to fight with tariffs or slogans, but to outplan the problem, to make Canada indispensable within North America's manufacturing web. It was a strategy built quietly, but its intent was unmistakable. If Washington wanted to play power politics, Ottawa would respond with design, not anger.
When the debate returned to Parliament, the clash had evolved. The opposition leader positioned himself as the voice of frustrated workers, angry, direct, appealing to those who had seen factories go dark. He painted the government as detached from reality, arguing that while politicians talked of accords, families were losing paychecks. The Prime Minister, meanwhile, framed the issue around teamwork and strategy. There's no I in team, he reminded the House, turning the line of mockery into a statement of purpose. To his supporters, it wasn't about wordplay. It was a declaration that Canada's path forward depended on unity, not isolation. Observers noted that beneath the theatrics, the two men represented two visions of the economy, one rooted in resentment, the other in resilience. Poilievre's rhetoric resonated with those tired of rising costs. Carney's calm response, however, mirrored a broader shift, away from dependence on the United States and toward a more self-reliant model. Across news panels and economic briefings, the message grew clearer. The true opponent in this debate wasn't sitting across the aisle. It was sitting in Washington. Trump's industrial tariffs had redrawn the map of North American production. Now, Ottawa's challenge was to turn that disruption into an advantage. In that sense, the Prime Minister's duel in Parliament wasn't just political defense. It was economic positioning. Every answer he gave, every statistic he cited, was part of a larger narrative, one where Canada could survive and even thrive without waiting for permission from its southern neighbor.
The auto sector debate revealed more than a policy dispute. It captured how pressure can create power. Canada has endured plant closures, layoffs, and political attacks, but beneath those struggles, something new is forming. Government data from the Department of Innovation, Science, and Economic Development show that industrial investment commitments in Ontario and Quebec rose by over 9% in 2025, even as cross-border tensions grew. Exports of EV battery components increased modestly in the second quarter, and new private sector consortia have begun forming around domestic mineral supply. These are small signals, but they mark direction, not decline. Meanwhile, the United States faces its own contradictions. Trump's tariff policies were designed to bring jobs home, yet they have fractured long-standing supply chains, raised input costs, and driven allies to adapt in ways Washington did not expect. For every American job gained, others in logistics and parts manufacturing have faced uncertainty. In contrast, Canada's slow and deliberate restructuring may prove more durable. It aims to keep industrial ecosystems alive, even if some production shifts abroad. That's why the debate in Parliament mattered so much. It wasn't only about defending past jobs, it was about defining future ones. As the session closed, the cameras caught a moment of quiet. The Prime Minister's sitting back, expression steady, while the chamber still buzzed with noise. He had faced a storm and held his line. The message to Canadians and perhaps to Washington was unmistakable. The country would not retreat into bitterness or blame. It would adapt, coordinate, and rebuild on its own terms. Trump's tariffs may have reshaped the continent, but they also awakened a new resolve north of the border. The confrontation that began over lost auto jobs might one day be remembered as the moment Canada found its industrial voice again, steady, confident, and ready to stand on its own.